Okay, good afternoon. My name is Eivind Engebretsen. I'm the head of the Sustainable Health Unit at the Center for Sustainable Healthcare Education here at University of Oslo. And welcome to this webinar, which is also designed to be an educational resource for students interested in the challenge of overdiagnosis. And this webinar is centered around the book We Will All Soon Be Patients, Medical and Social Science Perspectives on Overdiagnosis, co-authored by Alexandra Brandt Ryborg Jønsson and Brandt Brodersen. And from the perspective of our Center for Sustainable Healthcare Education, overdiagnosis is not only an important topic in its own right, but it goes to the core of how to foster sustainable healthcare. And the overall goal of sustainable healthcare is to ensure optimal well-being for all individuals, both present and future, while respecting the limits of our planet. And addressing overdiagnosis is an important part of this mission. In this webinar, the two authors will first introduce their book, and then we will hear 3 reflections from distinguished scholars in related fields. So I'm first happy to introduce the 2 authors. Alexandra Brandt Ryborg Jønsson is an associate professor at Roskilde University and a social anthropologist working within the field of medicine, public health, and social science. And Brodersen is a professor of general practice at the University of Copenhagen and has over 10 years experience in clinical practice. So fantastic to have you here. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting us. This is obviously a topic that we are very keen to discuss and to reflect upon overdiagnosis and all the consequences that it has. You just introduced us. I just want to say that I'm Alex. Nice to meet you.
And I'm John, and thank you for this opportunity to share our knowledge around the book we have recently published. Just to announce our conflicts of interest, we have written this textbook, and it's primarily targeting university students in medical and social sciences faculties. But we also would like to say that the target group is also clinicians, researchers, PhD students, healthcare administrators, authorities, and other healthcare professionals and stakeholders. We will get a royalty if the book sells more than 750 copies. For now, the book is only available in Danish. We are working on a Norwegian, Swedish, English, and Hebrew translation. And just also to mention that there are several books about overdiagnosis. They are all referenced in our book, and we have taken some few of them to show you here on the slide. All these books are not textbooks. They are not meant to be textbooks for university students, and the 3 on your left-hand side are all medical oriented and not social science oriented, while Sven Brinkmann and Anders Petersen's book is much more social science oriented. I would call those 4 books, no, the 3 books on the left, I would call them popular science communication, while Sven and Anders' book is also meant to communicate to researchers.
So one of the things that we hope will also encourage students and other people interested in discussing overdiagnosis is one of the consequences of overdiagnosis. And of course, overdiagnosis harms on an individual level, but also on a societal level. And what many people haven't really discussed yet is the climate effects of overdiagnosis. So there's a group in Australia that's been doing some beautiful work on that. It's not in the book, so we just wanted to show this slide and say this is also a huge problem. We know that healthcare services are draining a lot of resources, and we know that they are also responsible for quite a lot of the total carbon footprint approximately about 6% of a country's total carbon emission. 20% of this comes from different materials. You can use less plastic, you can use better resources for water, etc. But the main problem, in our opinion, is the clinical activities. So clinical activities are responsible for 80% of the CO2e emissions. Of those clinical activities, of course, they're necessary, but are they all? So another group of researchers has looked at what could we actually stop doing. And so 60% of what we're doing of clinical activities are good clinical care. It's effective, it's fine, we shouldn't touch that. 30% of what we're doing has what we call low value care, which means that it doesn't really make a big difference, and we should start discussing if that was necessary to present and to have in healthcare services. And the last 10% is more harmful than beneficial to patients. And the last 10% is what we define as overdiagnosis. So again, just to say a little bit about the book, it's written so that medical students and social science students can both read it. And there's 8 chapters. We've co-authored a few of the chapters, but you can definitely tell that chapter 2 about health culture is a very social science chapter, whereas chapter 4 on medical screening, for instance, is a very medical chapter. The interesting thing is that if you are a medical student, you won't really be challenged by reading chapter 4. You probably know all of this already. But if you're a social scientist, some of the statistics behind an epidemiological studies are a little bit difficult to understand. So we're really trying pedagogical to explain what's going on. Also, if you're already working with theories and social sciences, this might not be the place where you get new or deeper knowledge. Rather, we have strived for introducing possible theories that can be used for explaining overdiagnosis. And just another thing, this is a picture of Leif. Leif is one of the interlocutors that I've been following in my own research on overdiagnosis. And each chapter will begin with a presentation, a case. And the case is set up of multiple ethnographic examples so that it can't be identified, but we're still trying to give it some sort of human aspect. And so Leif here, who's the first case that we present, is an older man who has been diagnosed with prostate cancer. He's very, very scared of the prostate cancer. He fears that the prostate cancer will spread. For now, he doesn't need any treatment, but he will go to these surveillance programs. And it actually affects his whole life, and it affects his family, and it affects his wife. And in the end, he ends up dying from one of his many other diseases.
So when we are talking about overdiagnosis, we use this definition. Broadly, overdiagnosis means making people patients unnecessarily by identifying problems that were never going to cause harm, or by medicalizing ordinary life experiences through expanded definitions of diseases. And the reason why we are emphasizing that this is the definition we are using is there's no consensus in the international literature around the definition. There are different definitions out there, and there is an ongoing discussion of how to frame, how to define, and how to operationalize overdiagnosis. In the next text, I have tried in a paper to operationalize overdiagnosis, and here I write, overdiagnosis is the diagnosis of deviations, abnormalities, risk factors, and pathologies that in themselves would never cause symptoms. And then I make an exception. This applies only to risk factors and pathology, would never lead to morbidity, and would never be the cause of death. One of the major issues here is, can you be overdiagnosed and at the same time have symptoms? And in the book that I previously showed you from the 3 Americans, Wells, Schwartz, and Woolshin, they have written a book only about overdiagnosis where there are no people included with symptoms. So that's one of the discussions and one of the differences in the textbooks that are written right now. When I have taught overdiagnosis for many years, I've often met clinicians mistaking overdiagnosis to be other things. And overdiagnosis is not a false positive result. It is not the same as overtreatment. A lot of overdiagnosis leads to overtreatment. It's not overtesting. Of course, overtesting can lead and at the end to overdiagnosis, but most of the overtesting done in healthcare doesn't make any difference. It's low-value care. It's not misdiagnosis. Misdiagnosis, a diagnosis that is a misdiagnosis does not fulfill the diagnostic criteria, while the overdiagnosis fulfills all the diagnostic criteria. It's not incidental findings. However, a lot of incidental findings will be overdiagnosis. It's not the opposite of underdiagnosis, and it's not unwarranted clinical variation. When we do research in overdiagnosis and when we talk about it, we try to look at two types of overdiagnosis. One we call overdetection. This is where we find too much, and it goes especially on in screening. And then the overdefinition is where you change the rules of the game, and you could do that by lowering thresholds for treatment or by expanding disease definitions. And then there's this also funny undertype, subtype of overdiagnosis called disease mongering, and I will give you some few cases and examples of that. Let me start with overdetection. This is a male. He participated in the Danish lung cancer screening trial where he was screened with low-dose CT, and you can see he has this nodule, and he has it for 4 years. And at the end, he gets surgery and he has invasive lung cancer. So he has had this nodule, this cancer for 4 years with no symptoms and nearly no growth. And I don't know if he is overdiagnosed, but he could be overdiagnosed. And this is one of the major reasons for overdiagnosis, the heterogeneity in growth rate of cancer. Here you have this figure of 4 animals, a bird, a bear, a turtle, and a snail. And the turtle and the snail are the non-progressive or very slow-growing tumors. And because you can die from other reasons than the disease that you are screened for, you can be catched in a screening program, not having symptoms and die from other reasons, and then you are overdiagnosed. While the two other types, the bird and the bear, you can see will have symptoms. They will go over the thresholds of symptoms. If we take this figure and expand it to people, then let me explain it a little bit more. Then on the x-axis, you have screening rounds as time. You have 5 screening rounds. And on the y-axis, you have the size of the cancer. First, you have 1 abnormal cell. Then you have so many cells that now you can detect the cancer either by a biomarker or imaging. Now you have so many cancer cells that the patient will get symptoms. And up here, the patient will die from cancer because now the tumor has grown to a bigger size that will, kill the patient. Person F and person I are both overdiagnosed in this case. And why are they overdiagnosed? Because they die from other reasons. The red line on the right here. Person F is catched in the 5th screening round, die from other reasons, and will never get symptoms. Person I will be either catched in screening round 2 or 3, has a spontaneous remission of the cancer or the pre-cancer, and will be overdiagnosed because these cells will vanish by themselves. So one major reason for overdetection is the growth rate. The different growth rates, the slow-growing ones will be able to be overdiagnosed. Another reason is competing risk of death. So how long do you have left to live? When will you die? If it's soon, then if you test a person that is really old, then the risk of overdiagnosis increased. And I can show you by moving where the people die here to a shorter time. And then you can see that person D and person E both are overdiagnosed because they will never go to the symptom threshold. A third and last reason is the technology you're using. If you use a biomarker that's more sensitive, or if you use imaging with a higher granulation, then a higher resolution, then you can find more. And then you have to lower the threshold here for where you can detect it. And person G is then also overdiagnosed. I just want to notice that person A, that has a false negative result in this case, still has a false negative, no matter the resolution of the imaging. If we look at ecological cohort data, this is Denmark, and this is prostate cancer, and it's age standardized numbers. Then you can see around 95, 96 that prostate cancer incidence is doubling until 2010. And why is that? It's because GPs started taking a lot of PSA tests. You can see at the same time that the mortality is quite stable. It actually decreases a bit. When I talk to the urologist in Denmark, they say, we are doing better treatment now in palliative care, and we are doing better treatment when we do surgery. So here you have a signal of overdiagnosis, where you have an increased incidence with untouched or consistent mortality. However, the survival rate of prostate cancer in Denmark, and here you have the 5-year survival rate, it has more than doubled. And why is that? That's because people that are overdiagnosed have a 100% survival rate. And if you look at this popularity paradox, then those survival stories will go out in the society, and these people will plead for more early detection, more screening. And if we get more early detection and more screening, then we will have more survivors, and then you have this evil circle and paradox. Paul Glasgow in Australia has tried to estimate the degree of overdiagnosis among all Australians diagnosed with cancer. Here's his figure showing the women, and as you can see, thoracic cancer, renal cancer, melanoma, and breast cancer are the 4 cancers with relative most overdiagnosis. And if you look at the bottom bar with the combined cancers, the red and the gray area covers 18% of all cancers. So nearly 1 in 5 women in Australia with cancer, they are overdiagnosed. Now I will show you the slide of men. And here I will, of course, not have breast cancer, but then prostate cancer. And if you now look at breast cancer, the rate of overdiagnosis, then you can see that the proportion of overdiagnosis in prostate cancer is much bigger because the red area here is relatively larger. And here the combined cancer bar shows 24% overdiagnosis, which leaves us to 1 in 4 around. So when I'm interviewed by a journalist and they ask me, is overdiagnosis in cancer a big problem? I will answer yes, and I will say around 1 in 5 of our population that is diagnosed with cancer, they are overdiagnosed. You can also see an inequity in this, and here we see Gilbert Welsh and Fisher's paper on low-income counties and high-income counties and the incidence of 4 cancers: breast cancer, prostate cancer, thoracic cancer, and melanoma. And you can see there are more cancers in the rich areas than in the poor areas. However, the mortality is the same. So this is also a quite strong signal of overdiagnosis. When I go to the next type of overdiagnosis, the overdefinition, I love to use this Norwegian study where Halvdan Pettersson showed in his PhD that if you use the cardiovascular guidelines from the European cardiologist, and this is from the zeros, and you then measure all those risk factors in a healthy population, combined with some people with chronic diseases in Nordre Trøndelag in the Hunt study, then only around 4% of the Norwegians are still healthy according to those guidelines. So this, for me, shows the absurdity of how far and how astray those guidelines have moved. We can also see it in psychiatry. We can see it in the nomenclatures of the diagnosis. And here a professor, again, a Norwegian professor in general practice, Per Fugeli, wrote this fantastic paper of the zero vision, where he says if we go for if we want no risk in our societies, we will certainly turn us all into patients. And this is also a part of the overdiagnosis in psychiatric diagnosis. In Denmark, we had this paper published quite recently in July. It shows that the lifetime risk for a person living in Denmark for getting a mental diagnosis is 82%. And for me, this also shows how much we have widened the diagnostic nomenclatures for mental diseases, and how much milder symptoms we have included, and how we are colonizing ordinary life into mental diseases. Finally, I will give you some examples of disease mongering, and here we see that industry is quite good at inventing new diseases. Sorry for the misspelling of restless leg syndrome, but that's an example. Baldness, dry eye syndrome. By the way, dry eye syndrome can be asymptomatic. Then you have road rage disorder. So, and it should be treated with antidepressants if you ask the industry. You can also have a syndrome of short eyelashes. And we have also now seen that WHO has recognized the diagnosis of grief. So if we have grief too long as humans, we might be diagnosed with prolonged grief disorder. I also published a paper recently on sarcopenia, which is the natural loss of muscles with age. And it's now been suggested as a diagnosis. There's no way to objectivize the diagnosis, so we don't have any thresholds for it, and there's no treatment that really works.
So one of the things that we wanted to do with this book was to present the phenomena of overdiagnosis as a medical problem, a medical phenomena, but we also wanted to put in the context in which overdiagnosis thrives. And one of the things that we try to explain quite a lot in the book is what is health culture and how are everyday lives of regular people formed by notions of how to stay healthy and how to be responsible for their own health. So this is what we are up against. This is from an interview that one of our students did with women who had been participating in cancer screening, and then they were too old, so they weren't really participating anymore because of medical reasons. It doesn't make sense in Denmark, or at least in Denmark has decided not to screen women after the age of 69. And this woman says, it doesn't matter if I don't live longer, as long as I get saved from dying. And that is a funny quote because it doesn't make sense, but I'm actually not trying to make fun of this women. What we're trying in the book is to explain how come people can make such quotes, say such statements that doesn't really make any sense, but still feel it. And we're trying to explain a little bit about how emotions come into play when you are meeting evidence. So we're also going back to some of the historical explanations, and we have some chapters, some explanations on how medicine have developed, and then I'm trying to use a little bit of Michel Foucault's theory. And if you read Foucault and if you know Foucault, this will be quite superficial, but remember that it is meant to serve as an introduction. So I put a picture here from the Danish king back when he was the one who decided everything. And I usually tell people, remember how it was 300 years ago when most people's lives were all about making the king happy and making the rich people, the elite, happy. Life isn't anything like that today. And so I take a picture of an everyday Copenhagen setting and people look happy and they are happy. But in fact, life has become a little bit more complicated if you follow Foucault's thoughts, because back in the old medieval ages, if you were pleasing the king and you didn't do anything bad, you were kind of left to yourself. But nowadays, what has happened is that power has transformed, so we are always constantly trying to optimize ourselves. So I take this for Cook quote on how power has transformed into subtle recommendations. And rather than nurturing the interest of the upper class, welfare democracies control citizens through self-discipline. And power lies then in the structures and in the sediments for acting in certain ways. And sometimes when we present this, or the first time people who hasn't come across social science theory, they say, well, that's not true. I have my own free will. But then we're trying to say, well, remember how we always say that you should take responsibility for your own health. It's even in campaigns from, at least from the Danish health boards. And so Foucault uses neoliberal governmentality as a concept. We delve into that and try to explain it, both looking at the entrepreneurial self, again, what I said before, that we as individuals are to optimize ourselves constantly. And then we're also talking about this responsibilization and how that emphasizes your responsibility and your self-regulation. So individuals are expected to take responsibility for their own well-being and health. We're not saying that it's a bad thing, but we're saying that how this then manifests in everyday life, as we can see in my ethnographic studies, is that people translate this into something about, well, if I have to take responsibility for my own well-being, then I also have to be very attentive to my body. I have to be responsible for what I'm eating. And if, for instance, I am overweight, somehow I'm doing something wrong, because that's not how it's supposed to be. And a lot of scholars have written about how that really creates a feeling of shame and a feeling of almost bordering discrimination towards people who are, for reasons, either not able to or not willing to live up to those dogma of responsibility. We are also explaining a little bit about that in the book. Then we're using the concept of healthism, which is quite an old concept nowadays, but it means that health is elevated to a form of meta value, and it becomes a goal in itself. It results in an ideology that builds upon a lifestyle where health and exercise are prioritized above all else. And again, that can seem provocative, but when you see elections and when you hear politicians, health is always on the agenda, and it's always about more health. It's about trying to create an even healthier life, living longer, and not really going into a critical discussion of what a healthy life is, but just assuming that a healthy life means not having diseases and minimizing risk factors. We're trying to explain this into a health culture, and I'm also putting a little bit of historical perspective to that, obviously showing that culture is not something stable. Culture is something that transforms and gets influenced and constantly changes. And then we take the picture of the diet triangle. It has a name that I can't remember, kostpyramiden. What is important is that in many, many countries, we have something that looks like that. And it's supposed to show us what we should be eating in order to stay as healthy as possible. And this is an old picture, so we can all laugh from, haha, look at how much bread we were supposed to eat. Nowadays, it looks much different. But in an anthropological point of view, it's more interesting that we have these kind of advices that we don't really reflect upon in our everyday lives. It actually means so much that that when we have these kinds of advices, we take them for granted, and taken into that healthism, it means that being healthy used to be equal to having no diseases. You know, the kind of type who would say, well, I never have to go to the doctor because I'm healthy. But nowadays, when I speak to older people, asking them, how do you try to stay healthy? Do you do anything in particular? What they're mentioning is regular checkups, taking vitamin supplements, taking medications, being aware again of symptoms and all of that. And it's beautifully written by anthropologist Joe Dummett from 2012. Other people are also written a little bit about that, but we're just trying to state how life is now. And so how does that translate into everyday life? We do in the book use a few examples from some of my research. And again, this is from the same study where we asked women who had been participating in mammography screening and who were very furious that it was ended because of their age. well, how do you feel about screening in general? And as you see, the first quote, Annie says, breast cancer screening is something that you should be proud to have participated in, because now we can save thousands of women from getting breast cancer. Now, if you read the book, you can tell that that quote is simply just not true. It's completely made up that we can save thousands of people through breast cancer screening. But what is interesting is that it is transformed so that screening is not something that you do for yourself. Screening is something that we do for each other. It's something that is the right way to do. And I think my best example of that is one of my interlocutors who had a false positive and got very, very worried, and then decided that she wouldn't attend the screening program anymore. But she hasn't told a soul except for me and her husband. And when I ask her why that is, she says that if she really chooses to disclose to her friends and her close family that she doesn't want to go to the screening, they will be almost angry with her, because it will look as if she's jeopardizing her own health. And that jeopardizing health also means that we would rather have too much than too little. It's even embedded in our language. So this woman says, I'd better say treat too much. Maybe this isn't the cancer cell, maybe it's just a regular change in the cell, but still rather treat one time too much than too little. And this is a very important point in our book, that all of the people that I've been studying, living with, interviewing, are all saying the same thing, that they would rather want a little bit too much just to be safe. Not over-treated, they don't want too much medicine, but many of them believes that the diagnoses are of the better. So one of the theories that we also use is the very, very wonderful philosopher Zygmunt Bauman. He's talking about mortality and immortality, and we're using it to have a discussion about why is it then that health has become so much of an issue in modern day society. And it's probably something to do with the fact that we don't treat death as a part of life, everyday life anymore. So we're using Zygmunt Bauman. I'm not going to go into details with that, but that is quite detailed in the book. And I just wanted to mention some of the other theories that we go upon in the book. Again, they are superficially treated if you're a social scientist and know the literature already, but if you're a medical student, it's just meant to introduce you to a range of science that can actually explain some of the reasons why we have overdiagnosis. So we use a little bit of medicalization, but medicalization is quite a big topic, and there's also been written books on medicalization. So in the book, we're just mentioning it, and I'm, as an anthropologist, mostly quoting other anthropologists. We also talking about biomedical power and how that's been used to disguise underlying political powers. We're talking about uncertainties, and you might see from some of the references that they're quite old. So I'm actually trying to take some really old theory and say it's the same thing throughout life. We've known from literature, from anthropology, from history, everything, that man tries to control uncertainties. But we also know from studies that creating or trying to control uncertainty creates more uncertainties. We're delving into biocitizenship, because that's also an important thing, that if you want to mitigate overdiagnosis, you will also insult or criticize people who very much identify with the diagnosis that they've been giving. And then we talk a little bit about defensive medicine, which is also an important point in how clinicians feel obliged to do that little extra in order not to overlook something serious. So again, I just wanted to say that what we're trying in the book is not to explain to the full all of these points, but try to give the reader a form of direction for what is going on and what would be more interesting to be more lectured in. So it is very much a textbook in its format. Well,
yeah. Thank you for your attention, and now we'll stop sharing.